Welcome to Woodworking Wisdom with me, Sean Evelegh, where we're going to be cutting a mortise and tenon. The tools you'll need are a dovetail saw or a tenon saw. A crosscut saw is helpful but not necessary. A router plane, a mortise chisel, a bevel edge chisel set of calipers, a marking gauge, a mortise gauge, a marking knife, a square, a rule, a pencil, a mallet and some masking tape. What are mortise and tenons used for? Well, to be honest, they're the most iconic joint. They can be used on furniture and they're also used on timber frame buildings. They're extremely strong. Most of their strength comes from downward force pushing onto the joint, but they don't have as much strength as a dovetail in the pulling direction because the walls aren't angled. However, it's still a really strong joint. It will last decades. It will last as long as the glue lasts. So let's get cutting. The first thing you want to do is mark your face sides. And I want to pick the most beautiful grain for this. Okay. And because this isn't a through mortise and tenon, I'm not going to be protruding through this piece of wood. So I want to set my marking gauge to how deep I want the tenon to go. You don't want to go too far, otherwise this material here will be too weak. So I'm just going to put a little mark in the corner of this tenon piece. Now you don't want to run your marking gauge all the way around this board, because if your piece of stock isn't perfectly square, that can ruin your shoulder line and you could get a gap in the final joint. So you want to mark this line with a square and a marking gauge. So with that mark I just made, I'm going to put my marking chisel in it. I'm going to put my marking knife in it, butt up the square and drag gently. And when you're marking these lines, you always want to reference the square off one of the face sides. Again, I'm putting the marking knife into that cut I've done, and that's going to ensure my marking line meets all the way around. Now, mortises and tenons, when you're cutting them by hand, are always the same size as your mortise chisel. That's why it's a good idea to get a set, so then you can choose what size tenon you want. You want to set your marking gauge, your mortise gauge actually, to the thickness of your chisel, and I've already got that preset here. I'm going to put this in the vise. And this doesn't need to be extremely accurate. I'm going to eyeball this tenon to be in the center of this board. The reason this doesn't need to be extremely accurate is when we mark the mortise on the second board, you're again going to be referencing off that face side. So you don't want to engage both wheels at the same time, because that can give you an inaccurate mark. So you just want to focus on one wheel at a time. You want to go lightly at the beginning. And then go a bit deeper. You want a shoulder all the way around the tenon. This is going to help the tenon to stop twisting and also make the joint look cleaner in the end and hide any gaps. The shoulder on the edges, I'm just going to make 5 millimeters wide. So now we've got the width of the tenon marked out, we want to know the length of it. Now the easiest way to transfer this is with a set of calipers. And I'm going to eyeball this. I want the shoulder on either side of the tenon to be around 5mm. And then I'm going to make a mark like that. And remember to keep your calipers in this set position. You're going to use a pencil again and a square. Engage the pencil into that mark you just made and draw a line. While you're here, I'm going to carry these lines down the face. That's going to help me guide the saw and cut straight. It's always good to do this all the way around the board, because then you can look on both sides of the cut with your saw to see if you're cutting accurately on both sides. Okay, so now we have the tenon marked out. It's time to mark out the mortise. With the calipers I already set, I'm going to remember what my face side is. I'm just going to put 2 marks in the center. So now we've got the tenon fully marked out, it's time to mark out the mortise. So you want to put the boards back together, remember what your face sides are, and to make that mark you want to use the calipers again. And I'm going to roughly put this in the middle and mark those 2 points here. If you were using a ruler and a pencil, this mark transfer won't be as accurate because you could always be one side of the millimeter, whereas with the calipers you can now put your pencil into that mark you just created and make your line. Now again, referencing off the face edge, I'm going to use my mortise gauge and make those marks. Like that. Now, because we're not going through the board, we don't need to do any marks on the other side. However, if it's helpful and for this demonstration, I'm just going to mark a line here so we know how deep I'm going. Okay, so it's very important to cut the mortise first, because if you cut the tenon first and then the mortise, it might be too loose. You want to fine-tune the tenon to fit into the mortise you've cut. So I'm going to bring it over to this vise. It's always a good idea to hammer directly on top of the leg of your workbench, so you're going to get maximum force and as little vibration. Now, when you're holding the mortise chisel, you don't want to be side on, because your chisel cannot be square and plumb. The best place to sand is down the length of your timber, because this is the most important angle for your chisel. If it's slightly off, then you're going to not get a straight mortise and there'll be a gap. So when you're cutting your mortise, you want to start off in the middle and do small taps to begin with. And then you want to move back. And you can get deeper and deeper as you go, because you're creating space for the waste to go into. You do not want to go too close to that line, because we're going to be using the chisel to pry that waste material out, which can bruise that marking gauge line. So I'm going to go away about 5mm from that marking gauge line. And then try and pry as much waste out of the joint as you can. If you had a huge mortise, you can remove most of this waste with a drill to make this process quicker. You can see I'm bending the chisel back to lift up the material. That's why you don't want to go right up to the marking gauge line, because you do end up bruising quite a lot of material. Now, to work out how deep you want to go, you can actually use some masking tape and wrap a little piece around your chisel, and that can be used as a depth gauge. So I'm just referencing it off the tenon piece to see how long the tenon is. Now I know I don't want to pass where this masking tape is. So I'm just taking little bits at a time. You don't want to rush this process. The rougher you are, the more messy the inside is, and you could get a loose joint. We're now at the depth we want. We just need to remove all the material. A small bevel edge chisel can also be handy for removing the waste. Now we've removed all the waste in the centre, we can start paring back to that line. And I'm sighting down both sides to make sure I'm cutting straight. I'm using the small chisel just to break up the waste in there so it's easier to get it out. Now I'm just looking into the mortise to see if there's any high spots to get rid of. Okay, the mortise is now cut. Now it's time to cut the tenon, and I'm going to keep fine-tuning the tenon until it fits snugly into that mortise. So I'm going to put it upright into the vise. And you can use a tenon saw or a dovetail saw. And if you're confident, you can go right on the outside of the line. However, I only recommend this if you're very comfortable using the saw, because if you get it wrong, then your joint might be too loose. So I often go slightly off the line, and then later I'll pare back to the line with a chisel or the router plane. So I'm using my 2 fingers as a guide. I'm going to sight down the saw, look on both sides as I cut to guarantee I'm cutting straight. Remember not to go too far. If you go past that marking gauge line, then it's going to show up in the final joint. You can see I'm constantly looking around the piece of wood as I'm cutting to make sure I'm following the lines. I'm now going to cut the other 2 shoulders off. I'm going to do that before I cross-cut these off, otherwise I'll lose my marking gauge line. So now all the rip cuts are made. You can see the tenon there. I'm going to use a crosscut saw. If you don't have one, you can still use a rip saw to cut all this waste off. Again, I'm not going to touch the line because I'm going to use a chisel later to pair up to it. So the tenon is now cut, and I'm going to clean up all the edges with chisels and a router plane. I'm going to clamp it down to the front of the workbench. And with a router plane, you want to take very small passes at a time, gradually lowering the blade down. If you take off too much material, with the bevel of the blade is going to pull it deeper into the tenon, and then you'll end up removing too much. So I'm looking at the marking gauge line, setting the blade to just below the surface, tightening it down, and then I'm going to remove the waste. And I'm going to test the fit each time so I know I'm not removing too much. So that's getting pretty snug now. You can see I'm using this other block of wood as a bit of support on the other side. You can do this when both pieces of wood are the same thickness. We're getting very close. So the tenon is now fitting pretty snugly. Now all I need to do is clean up this shoulder line. You want to do that with bevel edge chisels. You can remove little bits at a time with a smaller one, but the final pass on the marking gauge line, you want to use the biggest chisel you have. If it's too small, then it can end up not being parallel to the line. So you want all that reference surface area into the line to ensure you're cutting parallel and straight. So I'm going to clamp this to the front of the workbench. You don't want to put it into your vise because as you're hammering down, the wood can slip down the vise. So you want to put it on top of your table so it won't move anywhere. You want to make sure your chisels are very sharp, especially your last one that's going into the marking gauge line. And you don't want to hog away all the material in one go because of the bevel of the chisel. It will push it into the work and you'll go past the marking gauge line and it will dent it. So you want to literally halve the waste each time until there's so little material left you can't halve it and you have to put the chisel in that marking gauge line. So I think I can get away with 2 passes here, halving the material and then 1 final pass. This time I'm sitting across the workpiece, not sighting down the length of it, because I want to sight down this chisel, making sure it's cutting straight. If it had to be off, you want it to be cutting more into the workpiece than tapering out, because in the end you want a slight undercut for it to seat properly in the joint. So I've removed most of the waste. Now I'm going to switch over to the big chisel to do the final pass. I'm going to put the tip of the chisel in the marking gauge line, and if it's sharp enough, it should slot in there nicely. Now do the other side. While we're here, I'm just going to chamfer the top of this tenon. This is good for two reasons. It helps locate it in the joint when you're gluing up, and also gives a place for the glue to go at the bottom of the joint if you put too much in. Now I'm going to head over to the vise to do the final cleanup. You want to make sure you can see a white line all the way around the piece of wood, because that is your marking gauge line. You don't want to go deeper than that white line. Inside the joint, you do want to do a little undercut, but you definitely don't want to pass the white line on the outside. Okay, now it's time to see if it fits. So it looks pretty good. Now I'm going to add some glue into the mortise and let's join it together. So I'm using Titebond Original. I'm going to put some of it in this tray. You don't need too much. The more glue you add, the more squeeze out you're going to get, and then it's more work later cleaning it up. So you don't need to add too much glue on the joints. That being said, I do like adding glue on all the surfaces. If you do end up with a tiny gap in your joint, the glue quite often can swell the wood and fill in that gap. So it's good to put a bit of glue everywhere. So I'm going to put some in the mortise first. Don't do too much, because if all the glue gets pushed to the bottom of the joint, it can prevent the tenon from fully seating in, and there'll be an airlock in the bottom. I'm going to put a bit of glue on the shoulders. Finally, some on the tenon. All right. So remember your face edges, so you're putting the joint together correctly. And that has gone in nicely. I'm going to use one clamp. So that's closed up nicely, not a ton of squeeze out. You can use a damp rag to remove any excess, or you can wait till it hardens and use a chisel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this set for an hour, clean it up, and then we'll look at the final result. So that is the Mortice and Tenon complete. The shoulder line is tight all the way around. I'm extremely happy with that. So I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.